Chapter 15. The train ride back to New Orleans with Gregory was a difficult kind of delight. It was hard to sit anywhere within visible range of him and not have him touch her. It made her itch to not be able to curl up against his arm, but he had determined that he would sit across from her, and there were other travelers in the compartment, so there was no changing the state of things. It was a clear sign that they had left the dream world of their country paradise behind and were now returning to the social world with all of its rules and constraints, which in turn was a clear sign to Vivian that they were riding this train in the wrong direction. She closed her eyes for a moment and envisioned herself in an apron and with a broom in hand, sweeping the worn old floor in Gregory's cottage, where they would live together in pastoral bliss. She opened her eyes again, and there was Gregory, looking at her and smiling. Well, she would just have to convince him, that was all. She was not a child, and he may as well know it. It would require some thinking, but she was sure she could find a way. The train was very loud, so there was not much of an atmosphere for conversation, leaving Vivian free to keep looking at Gregory and dreaming, and from the way he smiled back, she wondered if he could read her thoughts. Gregory on horseback had been an unparalleled glory. It made her knees go weak just to think of it again, his tall, lean body pitched forward over the horse, as both horse and rider came together in one unified purpose, to shred space as rapidly as possible. There was a similar kind of power in both the man and the animal, something rough and wild, and as she had watched them, the strange sensation had come over her of being there with him, feeling him behind her as they rode, forgetting that she was just a bystander. And the sight of Gregory in his rolled-up shirt-sleeves and chopping wood, well, there was really nothing at all that could be said about that did not make her all breathless again. She felt herself blushing, and knew he was looking at her, which made her blush even more. His eyes closed for a moment, as if he was enjoying the way that her body was betraying her thoughts, and that made her blush again, just to think of it in that way. She was worried about what their fellow passengers might be thinking, but none of them were looking at them. Their wordless dialogue between them continued all the way to New Orleans. The arrival at the station was quick. Gregory told her to go out in the opposite direction from him and to wait in front of the station for a coach taxi. He walked off the train with his bag and vanished in the traffic of the station. Vivian went out to the street as she had been directed to do, and before long, a rented motor car pulled up before her, with Gregory waving to her from the back seat. He opened the door for her, and she got in. "What an adventure we are living!" exclaimed Vivian, as she sat down on the leather bench beside him. "Would you believe that I have never ridden in a motor car before?" Gregory laughed out loud. "You are easily amused," he said. "For me, I think it pales in comparison to riding on a horse." "Well, I cannot say I entirely disagree," replied Vivian. He was too far away from her like this. The bench seemed to go on for miles. She looped her arm through his and pulled herself closer. He gave a soft laugh. They reached the book repair shop, and Gregory asked the car to wait while they both got out and delivered Mr. Wolfgang Gerstner his 2 new books. Vivian said nonsense. Why should the driver have to wait even longer while both of them disembarked? She would run in and drop them off herself while Gregory waited with the driver, and she was out the door before he could make any complaint. She ran to the door of the shop and opened it. Inside was Mr. Gerstner himself, very surprised at her sudden appearance in his store. "Fräulein Vivian," he exclaimed, "it is good to see you again. I'm afraid Gregor is not in today." "I know. He is in the taxi car just outside and waiting to take me home. We were out in the country today," Vivian replied. "Ah, his country place. I hope you had a pleasant day there," said Mr. Gerstner. "We did very much so," replied Vivian. I'm just here to drop off 2 books that we picked up for you at an estate sale." She handed him the books and smiled. "Well, I must be going so that they do not have to wait too long for me. Goodbye, Mr. Gerstner." He took the books from her, flipped through them, and then thanked her. She was almost back out the door when an idea suddenly came to her, a question that had lingered in her mind from her first visit to Thibodeau. She paused with her hand on the door, turning back to face the direction of the shop counter. "Excuse me, Mr. Gerstner, who owns the land that the farm is on?" "Why, Gregor does. It is all his, over 800 acres of it, from the road down, including all of the forest, and a good piece of the swamp as well. You've met the Moulins, his tenants," replied Mr. Gerstner. Vivian nodded as if in a daze. So this was how things really stood. "And what about Tant le Désiré?" she asked. Mr. Gerstner's eyes narrowed. "Yes, he owns that too, but you will have to ask him about that, if he wishes to tell you." Vivian gulped. "I understand. Well, it was good to see you again, Mr. Gerstner. Goodbye." "Auf Wiedersehen, Fräulein Vivian," he called after her. Vivian ran back to the waiting taxi car. Gregory came out to open her door for her, and then he got back in beside her. She looked at him, heart pounding. "It really is exciting for you to ride in one of these, isn't it?" he said with a smile. She sighed. This meant that he could not exactly read her mind, just her mood. Oh, thank heavens for that. The Moulins rented the farm from Gregory. Gregory had told her and her mother that his financial situation was not dependent on his job as a book deliverer, but she had not imagined that his wealth had extended to over 800 acres of land. Why had he kept this from them, she wondered. And what about Tant le Désiré? He must have been very much interested in the property to have purchased it. But why buy a property from which the house has already been removed? It was a Danish soap magnate who had bought it, right? What exactly had Gregory said about that? "Vivi, what makes you so quiet suddenly?" Gregory asked her. "Silence, let me think," she wanted to tell him, heart still pounding. Instead, she said, "I suppose it is that I know I will be back at home soon, and I want this day to never end." She felt his hand brushing against her hair. "Dear one, go home, wait for dark, go to sleep, and hurry into the land of dreams. I am already there, waiting for you." He kissed the top of her head. Vivian savored being kissed by him, but her mind kept busily spinning. Why had he not wanted to tell her the truth? Was there something about it that he was ashamed of? Now it made sense why Mr. and Mrs. Mullins had exchanged those odd looks when Gregory said that the Mullins were the farm's owners. It also made sense why the Mullins were so tolerant of Gregory's unusual dining habits. He was their landlord. And all those horses, they were probably all his. "Here we are. Jump out and hurry, Vivi. It is almost sunset, and I do not want to incur your mother's wrath. Be good, and I will come and visit you soon," he said. She heard Gregory's velvety voice, although she was far away in her thoughts, and it pulled her back to the moment. "Thank you for today, Gregory. I had the most wonderful time that anyone ever had." She threw her arms about his neck, and he squeezed her in return. And then he opened the door for her, and she ran out and down the street before he could follow, before Mrs. Bailey or any other neighbor saw her climbing out of a motor car with 2 men in it. She opened the door of their house, ran up the dark stairs, and did not stop until she was at the door of the apartment. Her mother welcomed her home, asked her about her trip, and was probably not surprised to see that her daughter was happy but entirely distracted for the rest of the evening. At dinner, Vivian recalled Gregory's words as they had said their goodbye, and so she finished her meal and went to bed as quickly as was feasible thereafter, eager to be alone with his memory in the dark. The trouble with learning something that you are not supposed to know is that there is really no one to tell it to, Vivian discovered. She wanted to speak to her mother about what she had learned, but then she knew that it must go against Gregory's wishes for her mother to know this information, since he had gone to such pains to hide it from her. She wanted to tell Nadine, but it seemed wrong to blab Gregory's secrets to Nadine as well, not to mention that there was something obscene in telling a poor laundry girl with perpetual financial troubles that Gregory owned so much Louisiana land. The person she really needed to speak to about this, she knew, was Gregory. But there she was far too timid to bring up the subject. If he had wanted her to know, he would have told her, she kept repeating to herself. On the other hand, only Gregory could explain to her why he had withheld the information in the first place. Gregory came to visit them again a few days later, and then a few days again after that, but nothing out of the ordinary was discussed. Now that she wanted to be in his arms, beneath his hands somehow, just about all of the time, having him sit there politely and make small talk with her mother drove her almost out of her mind with frustration. Would that some neighbor would come with a request for assistance of some kind, or that some other reason would take her mother out of the apartment for a while, so that Vivian and Gregory could be alone. But no such luck. It was back to a black coffee in his hands, and formal, light conversation with them, while the radio played in the background and they sewed. Vivian glared down at her needle and considered stabbing someone with it, only she knew that Gregory was upset by blood, and so that stopped her from doing it. For brief stretches she would find herself listening to him as he spoke, and she would forget that he was on the sofa and she was at the sewing machine, and then she would float off to a kind of brief happiness. But when he stopped speaking and she returned to her senses, the itching sensation of wanting to have him touch her and hold her started to take over. In short, nothing on offer in this strange and formal friendship could come close to assuaging the hunger for intimacy with him that their second visit to Thibodeau had lit in her. And the fact that Gregory was able to easily adjust to this return to formality while she struggled with it made her doubt how much he really cared in comparison to her feelings for him. Then at last, on his third visit after their day in Thibodeau, Gregory invited Vivian out for a walk in New Orleans City Park. The day was partly cloudy, but Vivian would have eagerly rushed out into hail and lightning bolts to be alone with Gregory. They walked along past the New Orleans Museum of Art, but did not go in. They passed the peristyle, and soon they found themselves by the dueling lawn and the suicide oak. "Now that is an incredible tree," stated Gregory with conviction. "It must be very old," said Vivian. "Look at that huge tree trunk. Did people ever duel on the lawn here? Really? I always wondered about that." "Of course they did, and unhappy lovers did themselves in over there. Don't you know your history?" Gregory asked her. "Would you ever fight in a duel?" she asked him. Gregory shrugged. "I suppose I might, if properly induced. But there seem to be fewer reasons to duel than there used to be. Honor has gone the way of the Indian. Also, in the past, a gentleman might fight over a lady. These days, if you wait long enough, the first man may tire of her, so you may get her yet." "Honestly, Mr. Morgan, how cynical," Vivian replied, but she could not help but smile. Gregory laughed. "Now that you usually call me Gregory, hearing you call me Mr. Morgan is strangely thrilling again. Here, wait on the path for just a moment." He vanished into the trees and came back, holding a lone daffodil. It was growing wild there under the trees, he explained. She took it with a smile and held it carefully in her fingers. "Let's go and sit down by the wading pool," she suggested. They walked on until they came to the fountain that children used for wading on warm days. It was a bit too cool for wading, but there were children running about, and one of them looked poised to throw himself in head first, against the wishes of his mother. "That boy is a handful of trouble," Vivian said, as they sat down on a nearby bench. "Yes, that would have been me in days past," admitted Gregory. "I was the middle child, and my siblings were paragons of good behavior, so I really had no choice but to provide a lively contrast to them." "Tell me about your childhood," said Vivian. "You never say much about the past." "There's not much to tell. And then what there is to tell is a sad memory." "Tell me rather about you, what you remember from before the clinic at Metairie, and what happened after that," he said, evading her direct challenge, as she had expected he would. "Before Metairie, I remember that we lived for a while with my mother's aunt and cousins in Baton Rouge. That was before we stopped keeping in touch with them. I don't know why. My mother had a difficult time of it when my father vanished, and she did not know where to turn. We lived there until Mother earned enough to buy a sewing machine, and then we moved back to New Orleans and she bought the machine and began to develop her lady clients. I did not know all of this then. I just knew that we moved around a lot and stayed with people, and I had almost no things of my own. It felt like I slept a lot on other people's sofas or floors. Well, and then I started school, and after Metairie, my mother came to take me home and off to 2nd grade at another school." "Did you like school?" he asked her. "Not particularly at the time. I enjoyed being with my friends, but I was not all that scholarly. The most I have ever read in my life has been since meeting you, as you well know," she admitted. "And you? Did you enjoy school?" "I did, but I was always sneaking off to read something adventurous rather than doing work in my actual subjects. I spent a lot of time riding my pony and pretending that I was a knight of old, playing with sticks in the woods, that sort of thing." "What school did you go to? The elementary school in Thibodaux? Did old Mullins take you and your siblings in the farm carriage?" she asked. "Hardly," he laughed. Then he paused, and an expression that Vivian could not read came into his eyes. He looked away as he spoke. "I cannot recall exactly where I went to school. That bad memory, you know." Vivian looked at him. She did not believe for a moment that Gregory could not recall where he went to school as a child. Perhaps he had not gone to school. Perhaps he was some street urchin from elsewhere who made himself a large fortune somehow, and then acquired the property and the education that would let him pass for high class, and his stories of his mother were a fiction. Why else would he be unwilling to say even where he had gone to school? A part of her wanted to confront him, but then she bit her lip and looked away. "Where were your parents from?" she asked him after a while, unable to fully resist stomping a foot on his thin ice. "My mother was born in New Orleans, and my father, although the son of a Louisiana family, was born in New York City. This feels like some sort of an interrogation. I must say, why do you want to know these things?" he asked her defensively. Vivian looked at the children playing around the wading pool and tried to keep her temper in check, but it proved a futile effort. "Because I need to know," she said suddenly, turning on the bench to face him. "People discuss these things. It shouldn't feel like an interrogation, but just like conversation. I know almost nothing about you. Do you realize that?" "Well, now you know that I own over 800 acres of land," he said, looking directly at her. "Don't bother to deny it. Wolf confessed to me that he had told you." "Yes, and why did you keep that from me?" she asked, frustrated and confused. "It does not change anything." "Well, for one thing, I wanted you to care for me, and not for my 800 acres, he said, and she could tell from his tone that he was deeply hurt. "I do. Believe me, Gregory, honestly, I do care for you, for your own self. It makes no difference to me at all. Please believe that," she cried. "Hush, dear one, I do believe you, but I suppose I wanted to be certain. Forgive me. I have become very mistrustful of people over the years, he told her. But that is not the only reason you did not tell me, she said, probing further. No, it is not the only reason. Another one is, well, it is a bit more difficult for me to speak about. He looked at her with discomfort and uncertainty. The truth is, well, I do not know how to say this without sounding like a pompous twit, but there are some real differences between you and me as far as our backgrounds go. I was raised going to the theater and riding my own pony. You had to leave school to have more time to sew with your mother so you could better support yourselves. I do not care about this, you understand, and in no way do I feel superior to you or anything like that. But it does mean we come from very different places in society. What is most important to me, however, is that I strive to de-emphasize any differences between us, because I always want to feel closer to you, not farther away, and not separated by an uncrossable divide, or by my 800 acres. Also, announcing to your mother, whom I did not know as well yet at the time, that I own land, seemed like some kind of crude affront. I did not wish to make her uncomfortable, and I also did not wish for her to consider my fitness as a potential suitor for you, entirely on financial grounds. Is this making sense to you, Vivian? But you cannot tell me nothing at all, she exclaimed. I need to know what kind of a man you are, at which stage of your life you are, from what part of society, who your people are. I look at you, and your surface is so shiny and reflective, I cannot see anything clearly. I cannot exactly tell your background, your upbringing, anything at all. You are chameleon-like, changing according to every environment. You've told me you've read Aristotle, and I know you enjoy high opera, but then you're also comfortable as a delivery boy by day, and ostensibly drink like an Irishman at night. I don't understand you at all, and I need to. I need to know who you really are, and which part of you is real. Having finished her outburst, she became horrified at what she had just said. They had never had a disagreement of any kind, she realized. Was this another evolution of intimacy, perhaps? What would happen now? She was afraid. He could stand up and walk out of the park, leaving her behind on the bench, and she might never see him again. She held her breath. He looked at her with a surprisingly tender expression, and then his fingers reached for hers. He took her hand and placed her palm on his suit jacket's lapel where his heart was. This part is real, he said gruffly. What I feel for you is real. I understand your frustration, but I do not know what I can do to help. Say someone, Nadine or perhaps your mother, gave you a secret to keep. Would you then be able to tell it to me, even if I asked you to tell it? Well, I too keep secrets for others. Life is difficult, more difficult than you would want to believe today, Vivian. But separate that which is truly important from the rest. What is truly important is that I am honest in my dealings with you and in what I feel for you. What is in my heart is real, and you can believe in that. Vivian bit back the tears that threatened to overflow. His face, as she looked at him, his even features, his radiance, seen like this at close range, made it hard to think clearly. Will it always be like this? She asked him quietly. I do not know how it will be, Vivian. I only know how it has been thus far, and I've been alone for a long time, and in deep suffering. Give me time. You asked me what I fear. Well, letting other people into my world is something that I'm very afraid of. You first wormed your way into my world back when you were still a small child, and I think that made all the difference. I did not interact with you as I always do with other adults, with my guard up. I felt close to you. I let you come close, and when I held you in my arms, oh, Vivian, you cannot even know what that was like. Look at these children playing here, and know that you were more beautiful than any of them as a child, and I cared for you as much as any of their parents care for them. His voice took on that irresistible emotional throb that she always succumbed to in the end. But now I am not a small child anymore, she said. Is that why you now have to have your guard up with me as well? Certainly you are not a small child anymore, he agreed, and despite the fact that they were in a public park, he put an arm around her shoulders, making her shiver. You are a beautiful, beautiful temptation to me now, and I lie awake at night and think about you, and when I cannot sleep, I go out into the night, or write until I cannot write any more. Anything I ever do, or say to you, or try to keep from saying to you, is not to keep you away, but to keep you close. Vivian, Vivian, I've grown another world in my heart over you. He was so close to her now. She felt the warmth of him all along the side of her body, and those hands that were never cold anymore held her. She had never kissed a man before, had never even had the idea to do so outside of her daydreams, but now she felt her head fall back of its own accord and her chin tip forward to offer him her mouth. But she never found out if he would have actually kissed her or not, because right at that moment, a ball flew toward them, and Gregory, always fast as lightning, caught it in one hand. The unruly boy, who had finally given up on trying to toss himself into the wading pool, had thrown the ball in their direction, and now his mother came up behind him, pulled him over by his ear, and made him apologize to Gregory and Vivian. Gregory smiled at the boy, returned his ball to him, and tousled his hair. Vivian assured the mother that there was no need for further apologies. The boy and his mother walked away again, and Gregory looked at Vivian and laughed. You were right when you said he was trouble. Well, we are all so fools, said Vivian. I believe the parts of the park where courting couples sit are elsewhere. This is the part of the park where those who have passed from courtship on to marriage and children come to pass their time. Once we have that squadron of small boys of our own, we should plan to return here. He gave her a wink. Oh, so it's boys, is it? No girls at all? Well, I suppose that is all right. They laughed together as they stood up, but she could see as they walked on through the park that a sadness had come into his expression. Following the conversation they had just had, she knew better than to ask him what it meant. Instead, she held on to the daffodil that he had given her, and let that be answer enough for the time being. It was so frustrating that Gregory was so mysterious. Vivian wanted to speak about this with Nadine, and she got her chance the following week when her friend came over to visit. How's your mother doing, Nadine? Asked Vivian's mother. Not terribly well, replied Nadine. She has been missing work again. It was sometimes difficult with Grandma, and, well, forgive me, but I had hoped that things would be easier once she passed. Instead, it seems like things have never been as difficult. Vivian had mentioned to her mother what Nadine had told her about their home situation. Vivian's mother now nodded sadly. I will come again and visit. It is difficult, but we must keep on trying to pull your mother out of this sorrow, and hopefully she will soon find her sense of balance again. Losing your grandmother was a huge blow for her. But what about you? Vivian tells me you have a steady beau now. Nadine almost blushed, but then bravely smiled and nodded. Yes, his name is Frank, and he is an electrician's apprentice. He is a very polite young man, but we do not see each other as much as I would like, since he is almost always working. He is saving up money so that he can set himself up in his trade one day, when the depression ends. That would be a pleasant life, to be established like that, with money left over for amusements. Gregory's 800 acres came to mind, and Vivian thought about how unfair it was that Gregory had such great wealth, while people like Nadine and Nadine's mother, and even Frank, had to work so hard to keep themselves above the waterline. Vivian and her own mother were not that much better off, but if she married Gregory, then presumably they would be. No sooner had she thought the thought than she felt a terrible shame come over her. She had said to Gregory that it made no difference and changed nothing to know that he was so wealthy, and yet here she was, thinking about the kind of lifestyle that his wealth could afford them. "Vivi, what are you working on?" asked Nadine, walking over to the window where Vivian was pulling over a chair and preparing her sewing materials. "Mother got me this fabric as a Christmas present, and I'm only now getting around to making something from it," said Vivian. "What will it be?" "A blouse for the warmer weather," Vivian replied. "See here. I'm putting on these small square white buttons. It will have wide sleeves. That will gather at the elbow at a cuff, and there will be 2 buttons on each cuff. Then there will be more buttons in the front, and the entire thing will make me look like Marlene Dietrich." "That is asking a lot of a piece of clothing," commented Nadine dryly, touching the thin, airy fabric. "Well, if you need any laundering advice for this, you can consult with me." "And let me guess, if I would like to have electric lights installed on it, I should consult with Frank," joked Vivian. Vivian's mother laughed. "Now there is a fashion that not even the finest couturiers of Paris have yet thought of. Well, girls, I'm going out to shop for groceries. If you stay until I get back, you are welcome to have lunch with us, Nadine." Nadine gratefully accepted the invitation, and then Vivian's mother changed her shoes, took her shopping bag with her, and walked out the door. Nadine dropped herself onto the sofa as if she was a sack of coal, and she let out a sigh. "When do you think we will marry our beaux, Vivi? I don't think I could last much longer with things as they are." "Has your mother taken a turn for the worse?" Vivian asked her. "Things are certainly not improving," Nadine replied. "We will probably not marry until we are 19 or 20, so you will have to hold out a little longer," said Vivian. "Well, that's easy for you to say. You have a wonderful mother, and the world's most patient man to wait for you to become his. What could possibly irritate you in your happy life?" asked Nadine bitterly. Vivian put down her needle and looked over at her friend. "Well, now that you mention it, something is vexing me. It has to do with Gregory." "Really? That paragon of a man has come to vex you over something? It seems hardly possible. What is it that is troubling you?" "It is his mysteriousness," said Vivian, feeling foolish even as she said it. Mysteriousness did not even begin to fully describe the solid wall of secretiveness that surrounded Gregory. Mysteriousness sounded like an interesting and potentially positive characteristic. His secretiveness was more of a bitterness, and was erosive of trust between them. It was hard to admit it to herself, but deep down she feared that this secretiveness could one day bring her to lose him. How to explain this to anyone else? "Have you still not learned anything about his background or his past?" asked Nadine. "No, almost nothing. The most he ever said, he said to my mother." "Why do you suppose that is? Why would he tell me nothing?" "Perhaps he does not wish to tell the truth about himself, and he felt more comfortable lying to your mother, but not to you, his heart's dearest dear," suggested Nadine. "That sounds very flattering, but I'm quite sure that he lied to me about something the last time I saw him," said Vivian. "That cannot be. I've met him, and he strikes me as a very kind-hearted man. Vivi, are you sure?" "I asked him where he had gone to school as a young boy, and he said he could not remember. I know he has a bad memory, but I could see he was not telling the truth. A bad memory means you may forget you have guests coming for dinner next Thursday, but not where you went to school as a child. Why would he lie about something like that?" Nadine frowned thoughtfully. "Well, I cannot say, but he must have his reasons. Perhaps there is something about his schooling that he wishes to hide from others." I was also wondering whether he perhaps did not have the kind of schooling that he would like the world to believe that he had, said Vivian. Oh, yes. Perhaps he comes from very humble beginnings, but wants no one to know, said Nadine. How romantic. Imagine how he taught himself to read, to appreciate the theater, to understand German opera, to read poetry in French. Well, that would make sense then, why he always wears a somber suit and insists on being so formal. He is trying to cover up his modest background and to impress you. Vivian sighed and resumed her sewing of square buttons. Honestly, Nadine, I don't know where you get your ideas. You always defend him. I should have known you would uphold his end of anything. As should you, the woman he loves, said Nadine with finality. Has he kissed you yet? No, admitted Vivian. I mean, yes, but like an uncle might, on the top of my head. But otherwise, no. He still thinks I'm a child. He won't after you wear this blouse, said Nadine, standing up and walking over to Vivian so that she could admire her sewing. You unbutton these 2 or 3 up here and... Nadine, I couldn't. I would blush the entire time. I thought you wanted to look like Marlene Dietrich in this, said Nadine, feigning innocence. Well, maybe the junior version of her, admitted Vivian. Look, you wear this new blouse, and then if that does not work, come back to see me and we will figure something out. You are the most beautiful of my best friends, and Gregory Morgan may as well know it. Nadine smiled at her. I'm your only best friend, Vivian reminded her. But then she put down her needle so that they could smile at each other and embrace, as best friends should. Even without having learned any new information or getting any additional explanations from it, talking to Nadine made Vivian feel more calm. It was also difficult for Vivian to feel upset with Gregory for any amount of time. He was indeed kind-hearted and generous, and the effort he made to make her feel special and cared for could not be denied. He came to their next visit excited as a schoolboy, because Mr. Gerstner had told him that there would be a performance of Cyrano at Tulane University the following week, and he hoped Vivian and her mother would accompany him to see it. Vivian asked if Mr. Gerstner would come too, but Gregory laughed. He shook his head and said something about schmaltz, Gregory said. But Madame and Mademoiselle, you will love it. You will see. It is different to see a play performed that you know very well, that you have read every line of more than once. There will be in it for you that which the average audience member will not catch, and satisfaction from everything down to the last nuance of the performance. The evening of the play, Vivian put on her new blouse. She had hurried with her sewing so that it might be finished in time, and even though the weather was still too cool to wear it without a sweater, she determined that she would put it on. Gregory came by their apartment to pick them up and told them that they both looked lovely, making Vivian think it had been worth the effort. Vivian's mother was standing by the small mirror near her bed and making final adjustments to her hair when Gregory approached Vivian. He was very close to her now, and his nearness set her pulse to racing, as now it did since their second visit to Thibodeau, or had it always done so? "What is it?" she asked him. "Vivian," he said, in a voice so low that only she might hear it. "Your buttons at your elbows are undone. Would you do me the honor and permit me?" She nodded, her head filling with his voice, and watching him with fear and fascination. How could he be so close to her and do something so intimate, with her mother right there in the room with them, only with her back turned? Gregory's hands reached for the cuff of her blouse, never touching her, but watching him carefully yet efficiently button the buttons, caused a minor explosion within her chest. What was this feeling, she wondered? It was incandescent, like anger, but also different. She wanted her mother gone. She wanted Gregory to take her and pull her close. and she wanted to do nothing for the rest of the evening besides watch him unbutton and rebutton her blouse. Suddenly she did not even care that her mother was there. She only cared that he was there. He was on the second cuff now, on the last button, and Vivian held her breath, but still the wonderful spicy cologne scent of him overtook her. Sweet Lord, how could he be done so fast? She looked up at him with her mouth hanging open in shock, then awkwardly realized her mouth was hanging open, and so she shut it. The temperature in the room had seemingly gone up by 100 degrees. Her mother turned around and looked at them. There was a blur suddenly surrounding Gregory, as if he was not properly in focus. Vivian felt her knees shaking, and she wondered if this was the first sign that she was going to faint. And this strange feeling within her, what was that? Perhaps it was anger and fear, she thought. With the next breath, the room seemed to stabilize, and she saw that Gregory stood firmly beside her, not moving away, taller and more handsome than anything she had ever seen, standing so close to her that Vivian was certain her mother was now opening her mouth to remark upon it. But Gregory spoke first. Slowly, as if time had slowed to the pace of running molasses, Gregory lifted up his hand. Something glinted in it. Mademoiselle Vivian, a pin. You had left it in the fabric of your sleeve, unawares. Where? Oh, thank you, Vivian at last managed to choke out. Where had he found this pin? Had it really been in her sleeve? Had he had it in his hand already when he approached her, to create this diversion from the truth in case her mother turned around? It was like watching a magic act. Her mother recovered quickly, her surprise at finding Gregory Morgan within an embrace's distance from her daughter, now neatly explained away. Oh, thank you, Mr. Morgan. Vivian, this is what comes of sewing while daydreaming. She was working on this blouse late into the night, you know, so that it would be finished for today, she told Gregory. Gregory gave a broad smile. Well, that would explain the pin, then. I am glad I could prevent you from coming to any harm, Mademoiselle Vivian. He reached out his hand, caught hers, uncurled her fingers, and dropped the pin into her open palm. Then he stepped back from her. Having him step away made Vivian almost cry out. This was so frustrating. Why couldn't the rest of the world go away, and he come closer instead? Only the thought that he might think her immature and undignified kept her from throwing herself on the floor and pounding against it with her fists. Gregory went to get the door for them. Vivian's mother walked through it, and then as Vivian passed by him to join her mother in the hall, she felt him catch her waist and touch his lips against her temple. Her memory jumped instantly to the day of the Mardi Gras parades, and the man dressed all in black, with the black cape down his back and his black mask, the man who had briefly pressed himself to her in the street. That man would not have tenderly but cautiously touched his lips to the side of her face. That man would have thrown her back in the circle of his embrace and kissed her wildly until she begged for mercy. She thought of how her mother had once said that she did not think Gregory was much of a risk, and Vivian thought she was beginning to understand what that might mean. She was very irritated at these thoughts, but then in the dark of the hallway, while her mother locked the door, Gregory whispered in her ear, "Vivian, you are such a temptation to me. God help us." The feeling was akin to having a hot liquid poured over her, followed immediately by a bucket of ice chips. He did care. They made their way to the theater, and Vivian felt as if she was gliding above the ground on a cloud the entire way. Gregory was right. It turned out just as he had said. Seeing the play was a huge thrill for her. Seeing something with Gregory that had a plot and was performed in English that she could understand made it the first really great enjoyment that Vivian had ever had at the theater with him. Now that they were courting, her mother had allowed Vivian to sit beside Gregory, from which vantage point she toggled her vision between looking at the stage and looking over at him. Already caught in an emotional whirlpool of her own, Vivian sat at the edge of her seat and listened with a pounding heart, and when Cyrano stood under Roxanne's balcony and told her how much he loved her, Vivian felt her eyes fill with tears. How could Roxanne's heart fail to recognize Cyrano's voice? And when he later spoke to her as a friend, how could Roxanne fail to hear the love pouring out of him then, although his words were veiled? It was a glorious, glorious experience. And during the scene where Christian was encouraging Cyrano to end the deception and confess his love to Roxanne in earnest, Gregory turned his head to look at Vivian. In the dark of the theater, his eyes glowed, their shade an indeterminate black. She looked down and saw that she had found his sleeve and was tugging on it. Surprised, she let go lest her mother see it, but he continued to look at her with the tenderest look that anyone had ever given her, and she felt herself melting away in comfort and assurance. "What a wonderful performance," her mother sighed as they returned home and Gregory bade them good night. "But Mr. Morgan is buying us all of these theater tickets. I'm beginning to worry that we are straining his funds. I spoke to him again tonight while you were in the powder room that we wanted to pay for our seats, but he just would not hear of it." Vivian thought about how many theater tickets it would take to make any kind of a dent in Gregory's financial health, and she had to bite her tongue to keep from saying anything. Instead, she took off her sweater and just said, "Mr. Morgan has not had much opportunity to take guests to the theater with him, and I think it is a real joy for him to be able to do so. We should not take this joy away from him." Her mother was silent for a while, then asked quietly, "Vivian, Mr. Morgan is an attentive beau? He makes you happy?" "Yes," Vivian replied, blushing and turning away. She did not want to have this conversation with her mother. Never was too soon to discuss like this her feelings for Gregory with her mother. "Vivian," her mother said again, "that thing with the pin, did he try to kiss you this evening? Tell me the truth. I will not be angry with you." Vivian's heart pounded so loudly in her own head that it was almost impossible to think. She clutched at the buttons on the front of her blouse. "No, Mother," she replied. "He hasn't. He never. He kissed my temple." "Well, perhaps I was wrong about him," said her mother, and Vivian could hear her starting to take the pins out of her hair and placing them on the table. "What does that mean?" stammered Vivian. "I also once thought that perhaps he was entirely uninterested in taking liberties with you, but then he would not have kissed you at all. He must care for you, Vivian." She sighed, and Vivian felt her heart pound even louder. He must care. He must. He must. Her mother had even said so. "Your father came into my life and swept me off of my feet. He made me believe in magic. He turned out to be a rather disappointing husband and father, as we both know. But at the beginning, it was the time of my greatest happiness. I trust you with Gregory Morgan, and him with you. Do not disappoint me, either of you." Vivian nodded, her back still turned. Her mother went into the kitchen, and Vivian began undoing the buttons on the front of her blouse with trembling fingers. Gregory knew how to button buttons, but how would it be to have him unbutton these, this long row of square buttons that ran in a straight line down her torso? She closed her eyes and flushed again, just thinking of it. Her blouse undone, she went to unbutton the buttons at her elbows, but then stopped herself. Gregory had buttoned these with his fingers. She would not unbutton them until this shirt was next laundered, she told herself, and she carefully pulled her arms out of the mid-length sleeves. She hung the blouse over the back of a chair and lay down on the sofa, thinking of how she had once sat on it with Gregory when her mother was away, thinking of how she had lain down on his bed in his cottage in Thibodeau, thinking of him in his study and writing about her. Darkness fell. She said goodnight to her mother and curled up on the bed that the sofa pulled out into, and she stared into the dark, calling his name in her mind until he appeared in the dining chair nearest to her bed. What was this new longing? What kind of evil could she want from him? What kind of betrayal of her mother's trust? He was an angel, after all, and he did care for her, so what more could she possibly want? Dear one, I would give you everything, his ghostly silhouette whispered to her. Be happy. Trust me. Sleep now. I am here. His presence by her side was so real that she silently reached out a hand into the dark, and as she fell into her dream, she imagined that her fingertips had touched feathers. Happiness can be quite fickle, but while experiencing it, this fact is often readily forgotten. Vivian was living through the days and awaiting Gregory's next visit, when one morning a knock came on the door. Vivian opened it, and in burst Nadine. Mrs. Prevet, Vivi, hello, so sorry to trouble you. May I speak with Vivian, please? Vivian's mother stood up, surprised. Whatever is the matter, Nadine? Is your mother all right? Yes, thank you, she is fine. It is Vivian that I have to speak to. May we speak privately, Mrs. Prevet? Give me a moment to put on my things and I will walk outside with you, replied Vivian. What could this mean? Her heart thumped with foreboding. Had Frank ended his friendship with Nadine? What had happened? Vivian quickly put on her jacket and street shoes and led her friend out into the hall. What is it? She asked. Shh, not here, whispered Nadine. And moreover, I think you will want to sit down. The girls ran down the steps and out to the street. The nearest bench was by the newspaper stand, so they hurried there. Vivian sat down, and Nadine, clearly distraught, dropped down beside her. Oh, Vivian, I was wrong about your bow. I still cannot believe it, but I must have been wrong. What happened? What about Gregory? Asked Vivian, feeling the bench drop out from under her and her stomach fall through empty air. Frank and I passed by the Fine Arts Theatre on St. Charles Avenue last evening, just as a performance was letting out. And there he was, walking out of the theatre with another woman walking beside him on his arm and talking to him. Gregory? Vivian hollowly inquired, knowing the answer. Yes, Gregory Morgan, all 6+ feet of him and looking as he usually does, like a divine being. Perhaps they were not together, just walking out at the same time? Asked Vivian desperately. I think not. She was clutching at his arm and talking to him in a most animated way. They must have attended the performance together, Nadine replied. And to make matters even worse... What? There is more? Cried Vivian, already feeling a pain in her chest, akin to what she imagined that swallowing shards of broken glass must feel like. Yes, the woman he was with. She was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. You are beautiful, Vivian, but I will not lie to you. This woman was out of our league. Older, tall, stunning. There is no chance that she was his aunt or anything like that. They passed through the crowd, and people of both genders stopped and stared. Imagine the female version of Gregory. I wanted to run up to them and sock him on the jaw for you, but Frank held me back and told me that it was none of my business. I woke up this morning having regretted that I did not at least try to get a swing at them. Vivian felt the street scene waving before her eyes. Is this what it felt like before ladies fainted? She wondered. How pathetic it would be to faint in the street over some no-good pretender who had played her false. A part of her found it incredible that this man who had always treated her so upstandingly would now betray her like this. But another part of her whispered to her that he had never told her the full truth about himself, and that this was the logical harvest of his secrets and deceits. Hadn't she always suspected that he had something to hide? Well, now she knew what it was, or at least what another part of it was. He was a no-good, untrustworthy rat. Tears hit her eyes and the street vanished. All she could see was Gregory, smiling at her on any number of previous occasions, rising before her like a spectre. Vivi, snap out of it! Nadine was waving her hands in front of Vivian's face. Vivi, listen to me. You need some kind of a plan. We need to confirm our suspicions, and then I will help you to dish out to this man his just deserts. I promise you, Vivi, I still don't understand how I could have been so wrong about him, but it looks like he has fooled us all. Forgive me. I was wrong, but I will help you get your revenge on this man, this low-down, no-good traitor. Vivian felt Nadine's hands on her convulsing shoulders, and that brought her back to her senses. Why was she crying again? Gregory was gone. That was why. In the corner of her mind, where his angelic shape had come to be at home, there was suddenly a darker shadow, made up entirely of his absence. Oh, Nadine, I cannot bear it, she cried, throwing her arms about her friend and sobbing. I truly loved him. How could he have done this to me? I don't understand anything. Hush, don't worry, we will figure something out. The first thing you have to do is go talk to him and confront him about this. Then come back and tell me what he said, and together we can think about what to do next, Nadine told her. Vivian nodded, still crying. You are the first man I ever loved, she thought, and now you have become my first heartbreak. How could you? How could you? How could you? Vivi, did you hear what I said? You have to go and talk to him today. Do you understand? Yes, Vivian managed to say. Good. Now sit up. Unless you want to tell this to your mother before you have all the facts, you'll need to pull yourself together. I can't, cried Vivian. Nonsense, of course you can. Just think of something even stronger than being in love. Remember how you told me about the Count of Monte Cristo? Think of revenge, Vivi. They sat on the bench for a while, until Vivian started to be able to breathe again, and to think more clearly. If Gregory was guilty, as it seemed that he was, then he should not get off scot-free, and she should think carefully about how to get her revenge. If he was not guilty, then crying to her mother about what a skunk he had been would make her mother hate him and not let him back in the house, even if his subsequent innocence was proven. Nadine was right. She needed to talk to him. Vivian stood up. "Thank you, Nadine, for telling me this. I will find out what this is all about, and then I will come by to see you." "You look rather dreadful and red-eyed," Nadine said, looking closely at Vivian. "Are you sure you're ready to go back?" "I'm ready," Vivian replied. "I must be. The longer I sit here, the harder it will be to explain. Let me go back alone, all right? Would you mind terribly if I throw Frank under the wagon wheels? My mother is unlikely to have any issues with you forgiving Frank, but she might never forgive Gregory." Nadine nodded. "Sure. Happy to do it. Frank won't mind either, I'm certain. Be strong, Vivi. You can recover from this, whatever it is. Come and tell me the news as soon as you know more." And with that, Nadine ran down the street and vanished. Vivian stood up. Her legs felt shaky. "I love him," she thought, feeling herself weaken. "Revenge," said the voice in her head. "Be strong." Slowly, feeling like her first day back home from the hospital, and as if moving on crutches, she made her way back to the apartment. It seemed like an arduous journey of many miles, but at last she was back at her front door. Taking a deep breath, she opened it and walked through it. "Is everything all right?" asked her mother. "What was Nadine so upset about?" Vivian walked into the kitchen, moving through space, as if she was crawling through gelatin, but hoping that her mother would not notice. "It's Frank. They were supposed to go out yesterday evening. He abruptly canceled on her, and then she saw him coming out of the theater with another woman. She was very upset about it." "I can well imagine," said her mother. "Did you say the theater? How surprising. I did not imagine that Frank was the type to go to the theater." Damn. You guessed correctly. I am new to deception, Gregory," Vivian thought, her heart ready to pound itself out of her chest. Did I say the theater? I meant their favorite diner," she said. Frank and Nadine went to diners together, right? "I was thinking of how we went to the theater, but of course Frank does not." She let the water run in the kitchen and filled up a glass of water. Then she turned the water off, looked at the glass, and did not believe that she could get the water down her throat. She left it on the counter and walked back to the room, sitting down at the dining table with her back to her mother. "Are you all right, Vivian?" asked her mother. "Yes, I just I suppose I'm a bit lightheaded for some reason. We ran down the street with Nadine and I don't know." "Oh, that is what comes of having such a light breakfast," replied her mother. "I always tell you that you don't eat enough. I will make you a hot chocolate. How about that? We still have a bit of it left over from Christmas." Vivian nodded weakly, placed her palms on the table, and hung her head. Her mother went into the kitchen. She is probably looking at the full glass of water now and wondering, thought Vivian. I am new to deception. I should have poured some of the water back out. "So what will Nadine do now?" asked her mother from the kitchen. "What?" asked Vivian. "What will Nadine do?" her mother repeated. "Oh, well, she will ask Frank what the meaning of it was and who he was with. Perhaps he can explain everything." "He had better be able to," said her mother darkly. "Poor Nadine. She does not need any more troubles at this time. Men can be such louses." Vivian nodded to no one, and then sat extremely dejectedly and waited for her hot chocolate. At first, Vivian thought that she would rather do anything besides confront Gregory about the mysterious woman. But by afternoon the certainty began to kill her, as she felt that she would die if she did not talk to him and learn the truth from him. She tossed on the surface of her troubled thoughts, like a cork, bobbing on a restless ocean. Fine for a moment, but then feeling the bottom drop out of everything again, as the full horror of his likely betrayal slapped her upside the head like a rogue wave. This happened over and over, hundreds of times an hour, until by early afternoon she was exhausted from fighting against the emotional maelstrom, and just sat and stared out of the window like a shipwreck survivor. There was some relief in this for her, and by the time the full noise of her inner emotional chaos returned, she had rested up again a bit, and was at least able to attempt to navigate through it for a while. "I'm going into town for a bit, Mother," she said. "I will see if I can think of anything that could cheer Nadine up." Her mother looked up, gave Vivian a strange look, but then nodded. "Very well. Do be home by dinner time, all right?" Vivian promised that she would, and then she hurried out of the apartment. She had to get to the book repair shop, she knew. She had to ask Gregory about the woman. What would she say? How would she say it? She might not have to say anything. One look at her face and he would probably know that his number was up. Yes, let him do the awkward explaining. She had done nothing wrong. Why should she feel awkward? Justified rage swept over her. It did not take long to reach the shop. Vivian pushed open the door and stepped inside. The shop looked empty. She rang the bell on the counter, both hoping that someone appeared and hoping that no one was there. There was a shuffling sound, and then out of his office came Mr. Gerstner. "Oh, Fräulein Vivian, what brings you to the store this time?" He was less surprised to see her than he had been when she had dropped off his books after her and Gregory's trip to Thibodeau. Clearly, Mr. Gerstner now assumed that Vivian dropping in at random times was going to be part of the new order. Is Mr. Morgan in?" she asked. "No, he is not." "That is odd. I thought he had said he had gone to visit you." "Well, he will likely be back soon in that case. Would you like to wait for him here?" asked Mr. Gerstner. Vivian nodded. "No, Mr. Gerstner, he has not gone to visit me," she thought. "He is probably lying under some tree in Audubon Park and trailing a line of kisses up the bare arm of that ridiculously beautiful woman that Nadine saw him with last night." "Very good. I will be in the office if you need me," Mr. Gerstner told her. "Actually, I will be in my office in a little bit. I wanted to first go up to my apartment and to look for something, and your arrival makes it possible for me to do that and not leave the store unattended. Sometimes I wonder if Gregory's bad memory is contagious. I've misplaced more things of late than I care to count. I live above the store, you know, so I'll be back in a few minutes. If anyone comes in the meantime, come behind the counter here and take their order, please, jawohl?" He smiled at her, and then stepped out of the store. The thought of serving any customers filled her with dread, but the thought of disappointing Mr. Gerstner was also an unpleasant one, so Vivian went to stand behind the counter. She tried to remember what Gregory had told them during the tour of the store many months ago, in case that would be helpful if a customer did appear. But all she could think of was Gregory, walking through the glass door of the store, and her asking him what he had to say for himself. She sat down on a high stool behind the counter and stared out the window. Any passing pedestrian made her think it was Gregory coming back, and her heart raced. "I'm worrying myself into an early grave," she thought. "This is ridiculous. I am the one who has been wronged. Why should I feel this terrible?" None of the passers-by came in, however, and it appeared that there would be no customers before Mr. Gerstner's return, until suddenly one person in the street began to come closer and closer to the glass door. It was not Gregory. It was a woman. As the woman crossed the street and walked towards the shop window, Vivian caught sight of a long dress, short and stylish dark hair, and a long and lean frame, further made more elegant by a pair of high-heeled shoes, the likes of which Vivian had only seen in films before. Her heart thudded loudly. This must be the woman. How dare she just walk in here? The door opened, and the woman stepped inside, and Vivian's jaw dropped. She was fantastically, iridescently, unrealistically beautiful, with violet eyes fringed by dark eyelashes. Hollywood had nothing on this creature. Vivian forgot all about greeting the customers and stared until she thought her eyes would pop out of their sockets. What man would look twice at a small mouse like her, while this starlight come to life was anywhere nearby? Gregory would look perfect on the arm of this being, Vivian realized. He had always been far too handsome for Vivian. What massive delusions had she allowed herself to harbor to be able to believe that Gregory could ever have really loved her, while creatures like this moved about in the world? "Hello. You I do not know. Do you work here?" asked the woman in an exotic foreign accent. She placed her small, stylish pocketbook on the counter and looked with great interest at Vivian. "No, I do not. I—" began Vivian, but then her jaw went slack again. Every gesture of this woman's was the most graceful and glamorous gesture that had ever been made. How she had managed to cross the street without a horde of bystanders following her into the store, Vivian could not imagine. "Yes?" said the woman sharply. "Mr. Gerstner stepped out for a moment and he asked me to watch the store. May I help you?" "I do not need a book repaired, if that is what you're asking," said the woman, and the way she said it was what you are asking. Vivian shivered. There was something fascinating, but also frightening about this woman. "I am looking for Gregor," she said. Vivian felt herself blush, then shake. This creature did not mince words, and she obviously knew Gregory well enough to call him by this variant of his first name. They must have known each other for a while. How long had this been going on? "He is out," Vivian managed to say, but just barely. The woman sniffed, and then shocked Vivian to the tips of her toes by walking around behind the counter. "You must be the one he refused to mention," she said, looking Vivian up and down. "He never mentioned you to me either," thought Vivian. She looked up at the woman, but said nothing. "You are such a small thing," continued the woman. "I had a pet bunny like you once. Gregor is a foolish ass, but what can you do? We all have our weaknesses." Vivian swallowed hard. "Excuse me, but please do not speak of him that way. I take offense at that," she said, surprising herself that she even dared to say it. She did not mention the offense to herself. The woman's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" she said, but it sounded more like, "What's this?" I may as well go all the way, thought Vivian. "I heard that Gregory Morgan was seen at the theater yesterday evening with a beautiful woman. Was that you?" The woman laughed, a melodious but somehow dangerous-sounding laugh. "Gregor seen in the theater with a beautiful woman! Ha! Is that considered front-page news? Little bunny, don't you know that Gregor is often at the theater and never lacks for beautiful company? He usually has a box at the opera, and there are several beautiful ladies in there with him on any given evening. The news here, if there is any, is that he was seen with only one." And she laughed again, this time a harsh, masculine laugh that seemed to arise out of true mirth rather than a seductive impulse to charm. Vivian did not know what to possibly reply to this, and was still gagging on the nasty emphasis that the woman had put on the word several, when the woman began to come closer, making Vivian's blood freeze in her veins. She wanted to jump the counter and run away. She wanted to cry for help, but it was as if she had been entirely immobilized. Just then, the door opened, and Mr. Gerstner returned. "Anastasia, why are you terrorizing our guest?" he said, eyes wide with alarm as he hurried behind the counter. "Who is this person?" the woman, apparently named Anastasia, asked Wolfgang Gerstner. The way she said person sounded to Vivian like one might ask about anything but a person. A speck of dust, perhaps. "This is Fräulein Prevet, a dear friend of Gregor's. It is my request that you not trouble her." Mr. Gerstner came to stand in front of Vivian, folding his hands across his chest. He looked quite old at the moment, Vivian thought, and she doubted that he could keep her protected if the tall, athletic-looking woman decided to reach over and throttle Vivian. "She is... what is your word for it? Cute?" said Anastasia. Her voice was low and throaty, and made Vivian think of Gregory's voice, which in turn made her feel sick. "Anastasia, I know that social graces are not your forte," said Mr. Gerstner, "but you are being exceptionally rude. Either go back to your hotel and wait there, or be more polite, bitte." Then he added some additional remarks in a language that Vivian did not understand, and Anastasia replied to him also in that language. After a few more remarks back and forth, Anastasia moved away and sat down most ungracefully on another of the tall stools. Vivian had to perch on it like a squirrel, making her look and feel ridiculous. Anastasia dripped herself down the length of the stool so that her long legs trailed along the floor in their heels. She smiled over at Vivian. It was a smile that struck terror into Vivian's heart. Mr. Gerstner turned to Vivian. "No sign of Gregor yet, eh? Well, he told me that he was going to visit you and your mother, so probably he will be coming back here by now, since he did not find you there. Your mother knows you are here and will tell him?" Vivian shook her head. "I left rather hastily and did not tell her where I was going," she said. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Anastasia looking at her. "Ah, that is less convenient. Well, let us hope for the best then. In the meantime, if Anastasia has decided to stay, let us make the formal introductions. Anastasia, this is Fräulein Vivian Prevet. Fräulein Vivian, this is Anastasia. I will not pronounce her last name for you. It is Russian and barely pronounceable." Vivian looked over warily at Anastasia and hoped it would not be expected that she shake hands with her. "How do you do?" she merely said. "How do you do?" replied Anastasia, smiling again. A silence fell over the assembled company, and Vivian had the distinct thought that this was the most awkward gathering that she had ever been a part of. And then, just when she thought it could not get any more awkward, the door to the store opened, and in walked Gregory. His eyes all sunshine, his hair all dark, pomaded moonbeams, and his entire look a glory of perfection that knocked the breath out of Vivian. This was the man who had betrayed her. Now she knew why he saw her as a child. Because compared to this unimaginably gorgeous woman, she looked like a small pet bunny that he had just felt sorry for after he hit her with his bicycle. Everything he had ever felt for her had been sympathy or guilt-induced, but he had never seen her as his equal, and why should he, when she so clearly wasn't? Gregory saw the 3 tense faces looking back at him, and he stopped in his tracks. His smile froze on his face, then disappeared. His cheeks, always pale, grew paler still. Yes, squirm, thought Vivian. Squirm, you 2-timing skunk. "What is this?" he asked. "I went to see you, Vivian, but you were not at home. Why are you here?" "I wanted to see you," she said, heart pounding and full of fear. "Very well. I wanted to see you too. Pardon me, but I will speak to you in a moment. Anastasia, what are you doing here?" He turned to the other woman. Mr. Gerstner interrupted. "I'm afraid that I stepped out for a moment, and while I was away, Anastasia and Fräulein Vivian, who had sat down to wait for you, became acquainted with each other. Anastasia has rather been frightening Fräulein Vivian, I would say. That is a very bad habit of yours, Anastasia, and you should really discontinue it," said Mr. Gerstner, turning to Anastasia. Gregory's pale face took on an angry look, and his perfect mouth, which had only recently kissed Vivian's temple, tightened at the corners. "This is not a game that I will tolerate," said Gregory in an icy tone of voice. "Consider Mademoiselle Vivian as an extension of me, and treat her accordingly." He turned to Vivian. "Are you all right?" he asked her with concern. That in turn made Vivian angry. "No, of course I'm not all right," she wanted to shout. "You've been running around with this woman whom you've never spoken to me about, and I'm supposed to be all right with that?" She said nothing, keeping her mouth tightly shut. Gregory's eyes grew wide in alarm, as if realizing for the first time that there was an additional layer of trouble here that he had not even imagined could exist. "Vivian, come with me," he said. "Wolf, may we use your office? Anastasia, kindly vanish yourself from the scene for the time being. There must be someone else out there waiting to adore you for a few hours." And he stood and waited for Vivian to get up and walk toward the office. Then he followed her in and shut the door quietly behind them.